Hi Minions. Over the last couple of days, I've seen quite a few drafts of your assessment plan. Many of them have the same questions over and over again. So I'm doing this video as well as the posting I put up earlier of a new version of the sample that will help you to address some of those common questions. So let's dive into it. The first one is this dates and the times of assessment period. Many people are forgetting our discussion about the idea that you don't start your actual assessment on the same day that you submit it. There are things that have to happen in between those 2 days to prepare. And then you have to think about how long from that start date you need to go for a professional and accurate observation. I also want to think about whether or not, in the particular case you're using, the facility where the person is going to be observed is open 24 hours a day. Is that realistic given that particular facility? Finally, next thing I should say is in the location where the plan is going to be used. Many people said the home or the school, but you have to think about whether or not we need to drill into the specific places within a home or a school where observation should occur. For example, perhaps there are issues around privacy, or maybe there are places in a person's home or school where they are not normally observed. Or maybe there are places within their home or school where that behavior would not be an issue, would fit or be appropriate. So got to think about all that stuff when you describe the location. The next section is the names and titles of the people who will follow the plan. Make sure that you are describing professionals, people that will actually be working with the individual as opposed to family or lay people. And make sure they are people who will actually be in a position to observe and record that person. The next section is the area where we're describing the behavior we want to observe and defining a discrete episode. Those are two separate things, and you need to make sure that you do both of them and don't confuse a person by changing your definition of the behavior when you get to the discrete episode. So what do we mean by describing the behavior? We're simply defining for people the behavior that tells us it's time to make a recording. And we need to do that in a way that isn't biasing or limiting, because we don't want to lead people away from potentially valuable data. Here's an example of that. Let's say I'm interested in finding out why a particular client often doesn't participate in scheduled activities. If I told people to record any time a client doesn't do what's on the schedule, that would not be biasing. It'd be nice and open. I'd collect information that was really helpful. But if I used the word refuse instead, and I said to people, right whenever Johnny refuses to participate in an activity, it would suggest that I have already made up my mind why he's not doing something. And it might make it both confusing and leading to other people about what they should record. For example, a staff person might not think they should make a recording if Johnny just silently chose not to participate, because that wasn't an act of refusal. So we want to make sure we choose a way that doesn't accidentally limit the information that we're collecting. When it comes to the discrete episode, all we're trying to do is help people know whether or not it's time to make one entry or more than one entry on the sheet. When does a behavior end, and what's our definition of a new behavior? And we can do this usually in two different ways. An amount of time might pass between one episode and another, or we might see a completely different behavior occur between something that tells us it's time to consider the first behavioral episode to be done and the new one to be started. The perfect example of this might be a trip. Somebody says to you, "Hey, did you go on a trip this summer?" You might say, "Yes, I went on a trip to 3 places. I didn't come home in between those 3 places, so I consider it to be one episode." But if you went to the same 3 places and every time you came home in between, you probably would have told people that you went on 3 trips. Why? Because most of us define the end of this behavior as being "I came home." That's the topography of a new behavior that tells us that discrete episode is done. So yes, this is something that can be a bit of a challenge, but stop and think about, talk to other people who are working on the same case. What is it that we're going to use as evidence to think of this behavior as being done? And as long as everybody in a team has the same definition, it usually means we're going to have an accurate assessment. The background. Some of the things I'm seeing here is that people are including information that doesn't belong in this section because it might be biasing or limiting. Even though people, when I sit down with them as a behaviorist, will tell me all of their theories about why a behavior is going on, I never put them in the background because they're leading. They tell people that I suspect such and such is the reason, and that affects how they collect data. So I don't put any of those guesses or limits or biases into that background. And I also don't include anything that's sensitive, such as personal information about the person's family. What I do want to put in there is information about the person's physical background, the relevant history, for example, how long have they been in a particular program, and particularly the history of their behavior. How long has this behavior been going on? Is it trending up or down or staying the same? And if we already have baseline data about its frequency, well, that's something I can say there. I also want to describe why this is even a concern to us. Are we worried about somebody's safety? Is this getting in the way of them having relationships or a job, for example? So we want to simply describe why this is something that has come to the attention of the staff team. The rationale, and you'll notice the spelling, it's not rational but rationale, is simply our description of why we are doing this. For most of you, you start to realize that this is probably going to give us a functional assessment, meaning that it gives us a sense of why the behavior is happening. It gives us a baseline, giving us a picture of what's going on so that we can later on see whether we've made a change in the behavior. So it's possible for it to be both. You need to decide whether in your case you're giving us information that's one or both of these. And what we're then going to do is describe what we hope we will eventually do with that information. For example, are we going to use it to devise strategies? Or are we going to use it to determine whether or not there's even a need for us to do something? Some people have asked whether or not they need to include indicators in this section, similar to the way the sample does. The answer is yes, you do. You remember we said that assessment plans answer 4 questions, and one of those questions is, what are our indicators? I put a slide in at the end here where I'll look into that in more detail, so hold on for that. The next section is the actual recording strategies or procedures I'm supposed to use. And what's happening is that some folks are just taking the methods from the sample and transferring them into their drafts. But be careful, because not everything that's there will fit your cases. For example, is it necessary to actually do interviews or medical exams in the cases that you have been provided? Will those particular techniques add information that we really need? Is there a reasonable expectation, for example, that this behavior we're seeing has a medical explanation? And we also need to know whether or not those other methods are going to give information to us that we won't already get by doing our ABCR observation. So don't put in more work than we need to. Many of you saw that you could use the questions that were in slides 13 and 14, and you've taken those questions and transferred them into your case. For the most part, they're a pretty good fit, but I expect you to go and make sure that those questions are adapted as necessary to make sure they fit your case so you get complete information. But keep them open-ended. Don't change the way the questions are asked in the sense that they go from being open-ended questions such as what is happening to a question that is closed-ended such as is such and such happening? Because those questions are far too focused on a yes or no answer. It also says in your instructions that you need to put an example entry into an ABCR form for people. And folks have asked me about this repeatedly. I think they've maybe made it more complex than it needs to be. But to keep it simple, yes, you need to do this. Yes, the example is completely fictitious. Of course, it has to be because the case is fictitious. It has to be an accurate example. In other words, you should do it exactly in the formatting you want people to do. And yes, it is of your case. It doesn't make any sense to create an example of somebody other than the person in your case. And people have asked me about what forms they should use. The ABCR form that I gave you in class is acceptable to use. Back to indicators for just a moment. Lots of folks struggling with this one. But we just did module 111, behavior and cognition, and it was all about indicators. If you see blank, it tells you that this must be blank motivation or blank medical cause. That's all we're doing here. You're telling people in advance how you will interpret the data. Most of the time we're going to express that as an if-then statement. If we see blank, then we are going to interpret it as blank. Now sometimes it'll feel like you're stating the obvious, but that's because you've been trained in some of this stuff when others might not have been. This is a way of making sure that we don't end up with utter chaos after we've finished doing our assessment, because sometimes people will take that same data and have a completely different interpretation of it. So we want to make sure we're accountable and agreeing on how we're going to look at this data later on. Make sure that the indicators you use fit your case. Again, don't just transfer the ones that were in the sample and use them exactly as they were in your case. Yes, there's lots there that you can transfer, but make sure that you don't just assume everything is transferable. Think about what you're wanting to know, and then the indicators will come naturally to you. If you're trying to determine why something is happening, then you need to show how your indicators will help you rule in and rule out. Here's an example. If Bob's behavior is consistently occurring in front of one person, then that will help us to rule out medical issues as a cause. Why? Because when people are behaving only in specific instances, it suggests that they're intentionally doing it. And when people have medical issues, they typically don't have control over their behavior. And we also could see that as a clue that it's attention seeking because the person's always doing it in front of an audience. So this simple statement helps us to say how we plan to look at the data later on. You'll notice that it doesn't tell us what we've concluded. It tells us how we will interpret the data later. So hopefully this little presentation helps to clarify things for you. If you're struggling with indicators, go back and review the material we learned in 111. That's where we got that set of pointers, what points to what, and you have to try and do that. It's one part of the overall assignment, so do the best you can with it, and don't let it be something that bogs you down. Okay, good luck, and I look forward to seeing your projects on Monday.